All right, why don't we get started? So thank you guys very much for joining. So a little bit of a different background today. So I'm actually in Nashville, Tennessee. So it's 10 o'clock at night. So a little bit of a different time. But anyway, we're going to talk about retirement and setting retirement goals, and obviously superannuation as the wrapper around that. But before we get started, anything that you hear today is general advice. So I obviously don't know anything about you. Can't offer any personal advice, but questions would be great. So if you have any questions, send them through, and I'll get to them as I go along, and then we'll pick them up at the end. So, all right. So we're going to talk about retirement today. So we're going to talk about setting a goal in super. And really, there's a couple things behind this. Number one is obviously, as you're going through and trying to plan for, and then of course save for and invest for your retirement, it's important to understand what you're trying to accomplish and what you need to achieve the goal that you have for retirement. So we're going to talk a lot about estimating what that amount is for retirement. And this is also important because obviously we've seen some changes around super, and we've seen some changes around the way that super is taxed, especially with balances that exceed $3 million. We've seen the government get, I think, more focused on making sure that super is in fact a strategy that you can use in order to save for retirement and not use for other purposes. So whether that's estate planning, passing on obviously wealth to different generations. And so that's why I think it's important to understand that, okay, if we are looking very specifically and if we're going to get more government policies to make sure super is for retirement, what does it mean to save for retirement? How much do you actually need? So we'll go through that today. So I'll skip ahead a little bit. All right. So very quickly, we're going to talk about goals, and we're going to talk about obviously why goals are important for retirement. We're going to talk about how to estimate how much you need for retirement, and go through basically these two different steps. So what's your income replacement rate, how to figure out a withdrawal rate, and then we will not brining it all together. We'll actually bring it all together. I had some food tonight that was brined, which was very good, but let's talk about goals to begin with. Okay, so why do we set goals, and why have we picked this topic for a webinar tonight about retirement? Well, we set goals, of course, because if we don't understand what we're trying to achieve, it makes it a lot more difficult to figure out the way that you're actually going to get there. So, biggest step in setting goals is figuring out how much your goal will cost. And of course, we do have to remember inflation, and retirement is a little bit different from another goal. So of course, most goals that we have that we save for financially, it is a set amount of money we are trying to save for, and then we'll use that set amount of money to buy something. Retirement is very different, of course, because we need a certain amount of money within our accounts that will then provide for an annual salary while you're retired that will pay for your life. So it is very important. So Lisa says brining is a useful way to preserve things just like super. Yes, I am a big fan of brining. So every Thanksgiving, I brine a turkey. Which is important because it can dry out. So brining is important. So those are the two challenges we have with the retirement. So we need to figure out a lump sum. We need that lump sum to translate into an annual income that you make. And then, of course, we need that portfolio, our retirement portfolio, to last until our death. And of course, we don't know when our death is going to be. So those are the challenges around estimating how much you need for retirement. All right. So we're going to look at two different things as we go through this process. And really, the first thing is when we think about this annual acceptable income, so the amount of money that we need to withdraw from our account in order to pay for our life, we need to think a lot about our income replacement rate, because it's a really good way of looking at how much you need for retirement. Because, of course, we spend our entire lives living off of a salary, and that salary is really how we set a budget. So when we move into retirement, an easy thing to do is looking at the salary that you make and figuring out how much of that you actually need in order to live your life in retirement. The other issue, of course, that we have is that our portfolio needs to last until our retirement ends. And that, of course, is death. And the very difficult thing about that is we don't know when that's going to happen. And so really what we focus on from a financial planning perspective is we focus on a safe withdrawal rate. So that withdrawal rate is supposed to enable your portfolio to last for long enough to cover what at least the expected lifespan is of most people. And so we don't want that withdrawal rate and how much we take out of our portfolio every year. We don't want that to be too high, because if it's too high, of course, you could run out of money. We don't want that to be too low, because if it's too low, then of course, we are going to die with a lot of money, and we are going to have a retirement that maybe doesn't live up to our expectations. So what we do is we take these two numbers, and we'll show you the math on this, or I'll show you the math of this. And then we come up with that lump sum we need to retire. And that, of course, is our goal. That's our goal for superannuation. All right. So very quickly, and I covered a lot of this before. What we need to do when we're figuring out retirement is we figure out this income replacement rate. So basically, that is the percentage of your pre-tax employment income that will be replaced by your retirement accounts when you retire. So very simply, if you have a salary of $100,000 a year, you need $75,000 a year to support your retirement. That, of course, is a 75% replacement rate. And there are lots of differences between when we're working and when we retire. So the first one is, of course, is that we save money generally when we're working. We save money through mandatory contributions into superannuation. We might save money outside of superannuation. All of that generally goes away, right? Because we're saving for this event, retirement. It's happened. Now we're actually spending our money. The other thing, of course, is taxes. So in general, for the vast majority of people, your taxes will significantly drop when you're in retirement. So, of course, if you are in the pension phase of superannuation, you will pay no taxes. So you will not pay taxes. And obviously, there are some exceptions that I talked about, but in general, you'll pay no taxes on capital gains. You'll pay no taxes on income, and you'll pay no taxes on the money you take out of your super account. And then finally, we have lifestyle differences, which we can talk about as well. But that's obviously going to influence your spending. So very simply, give a little example. I went to a tool. It's called paycalculator.com. And basically, you can put in whatever salary you make, and it will show you what you are going to pay in taxes, what you're going to pay in mandatory superannuation. And it allows you to look at your replacement rate. So very simply, I put in $100,000 into this thing and realized that the replacement rate already, if you're just living off of that $100,000, is a little above 70%. Why is that? Because you're contributing money into super, and you, of course, are paying taxes. So this already starts you out on a lower replacement rate. And then we can, of course, adjust that based on other differences when you are retired. So how do we do this? Okay, well, there's a couple things that we need to think about with salary. Now, if we are very close to retirement, this is a lot easier for us to do. But planning, of course, means planning in advance. It means planning before you are close to retirement. So what we want to do is we want to, as a younger person planning for retirement, we want to estimate what those future salary needs are. So that figure that I just gave above is great. As I said, if it's the year before you're retiring, you're trying to figure this out. So how do we do this? Well, there's a couple different considerations that we have to take into account. So first of all, inflation. We're all hearing a lot about inflation. So inflation works, number one, obviously on the cost side of your life, that the things that you pay for in order to survive, in order to live the life that you want to live, are going to increase in price. The other side, of course, is hopefully you get salary growth over your career. And we're seeing a lot of that right now, right? With different, with a lot of employees trying to make sure that their salary growth actually compensates them for the inflation we've seen. So what we can do is we can simply estimate this if we want. Now, remember, anytime you're doing any sort of financial planning, the key is not to let the perfection of what you're doing and the unknowns that are out there, or not to let the unknowns that are out there stop you from actually going through it, because it still is a very valuable a very valuable exercise that you can go in. And I've just used a calculator that we have as part of Morningstar Investor, but there are all sorts of calculators that we can use to estimate just putting a natural inflation rate on or a salary growth rate on to try to come up with what your salary would be. So very simply, what I took here is I took $100,000. I took it 10 years. Remember, we looked at $100,000 on the previous slide. I took it 10 years. I put in the rate of return 5%. So basically what that rate of return would be salary growth or lifestyle growth that you're going through. See what that actually is. And you can see that even over 10 years, it's 162,000, which sounds like a lot more. But that, of course, is the impact of compounding, which works on your salary and works, of course, or on your investments, but also, of course, works every other way. One thing we do need to keep in mind is that we, of course, live in a world with a marginal tax rate. So basically, as you earn more money, you will pay more taxes on that portion of your income that is growing. And the bad thing about that, of course, is as you earn more money, you pay more in taxes. The good thing about that is, so when we start looking at retirement, we start removing those taxes. The more income you earn, actually, the lower that replacement rate will get naturally just from the taxes you have to pay. So that isn't too bad. But as I said, looking at this current replacement rate isn't a bad way to go about things because being conservative isn't a terrible thing. Now, we have a comment from Steven. So how many people, while still working, test drive a theoretic retirement income so they can accurately assess their prospects when their paychecks stop? So if I was going to answer that question, Stephen, I would probably say not very many. But if you are someone who has done that, it would be great to hear from you. I think most people probably don't put that much thought into it. But that is certainly a good approach to go about things, and think very carefully about sort of what your spending is. And one of the reasons why it's really important to think about your spending is important to think about the kind of life you're going to live during retirement. And this is that last stage of adjustments that we need to make. And that last stage is really focused on, of course, how your lifestyle may shift in retirement. And I've listed a couple considerations on here. So are you moving to a location with a higher or lower cost of living? A lot of people do move during retirement. Big one right here, the second one. Housing costs, big part of people's spending. Will you pay off your mortgage by the time you hit retirement? That can have a huge impact on what that replacement rate is and what you need to support your lifestyle. Spending patterns changing. So I think often we think about retirement, we think about sort of constant spending rates over the course of retirement. But of course, that generally isn't true. So a lot of people spend more money at the beginning of retirement because all of a sudden you don't have a job. You are still hopefully in good shape from a health perspective, and you start going and doing things. So whether that's travel, whether that's just going to eat out more, whether that's just the fact that people tend to spend more money when they have nothing to do. If you don't have work to go to all day and work to concentrate on, people often spend more money. So a lot of times when we see a spike in spending at the beginning of retirement, then we tend to see that go down. So as you are retired longer, perhaps you have more health issues that prevent you from traveling as much. Then we start to see that spending go down. And then, of course, we often see a spike right at the end with end of life care. So it is important to think about how those spending patterns will change in retirement because it's likely that they will. And then, of course, we need to figure out, do we have any additional sources of income? So, of course, the age pension is one example that probably is the most applicable to most people. But yeah, is there anything else? Because, of course, those other sources of income will reduce that income replacement rate that you need because you're just going to get that income from somewhere else. All right, so here's a simple example. Current salary, $100,000. You pay some taxes, you save, and this is just the mandatory amount, I guess, before we've had the little up and super, goes into super. We know what salary we have to replace. Then, of course, we've got the fact that we think the salary is going to continue to grow because we're doing this, we're pre-planning this. We have reduced expenses. We have an age pension. Now we know exactly what we need, $69,000. That's a replacement rate of $56,000. So that replacement rate, of course, is that salary that has grown over time because we're doing this 10 years. So that's just an example, and obviously a very high level and simplified example of how you can go through and estimate how much you actually need. So you can go through that exercise. And remember, once again, as I said before, it's an estimate. You can change this every year as you approach retirement. You still get a lot of benefit about going through this exercise, even if things are going to change over time as your circumstances change. All right. So next we have a withdrawal rate. Now, mathematically, and we'll get into this in a second, it's pretty simple. What we're going to do is we're going to take that amount of money that we need, and we are going to divide it by a withdrawal rate, and that'll give you that lump sum. So mathematically, that's what we're doing. But think a little bit about what a withdrawal rate is. So a withdrawal rate at the end of the day, as I said earlier, is trying to protect you from two different types of risk. The first risk, and basically both of these risks, are you running out of money. So you running out of money before you pass away. And of course, we have no idea when that's going to happen. Okay, so we do have a question from John. So John's saying, I thought you can't get any pension if you have over $50,000 in earnings. So actually, the pension is based on an asset test that does not include your primary residence. So basically, you could live in a, $50 million house and still get the age pension. So yeah, I would go through and look very specifically about sort of how you stack up around age pension, but it is an asset test. But thank you for that question. So you're really facing two different risks that both impact how long you will actually be able to support yourself with your portfolio based on that withdrawal rate. The first is sequencing risk. So sequencing risk is pretty simple. Well, it's not pretty simple. I guess it's a concept that a lot of people don't understand. You do not want to retire when markets fall significantly. And the reason for this, and we'll go into another slide on this in a second, the reason for this is, of course, if you are 30 and saving for retirement and markets fall a lot, it doesn't really matter, because at the end of the day, what you're looking for is that annual average return that you achieve over your investing lifestyle. Problem is, the order of those returns, or that sequencing, really, really matter when you get close to retirement, because steep falls right in the beginning when you're starting to take out money can impact how long your portfolio can survive. So we'll get into an example of that, but sequencing risk is really important. And then longevity risk is just that you run out of money, which none of us, of course, want before we retire. All right, so let's look at sequencing risk. So as I said, the order of returns matters significantly. Negative returns early in retirement are a bad thing. So we took two different scenarios. All right, so two scenarios of 20 years, $500,000 portfolio, invested in the S&P 500. So the 500 biggest shares or biggest companies in the US. So the world's most tracked index, the S&P 500. And every year you're taking out $20,000 a year. So you're taking out 4% of that portfolio every year. So scenario A, we look at returns between the year 2000 and the year 2020. So what does that mean? Well, that means that you have $165,000 at the end of that 20 years. So if you are, of course, in a retirement that is going to last longer than 20 years, which in many cases they do, you're starting to get pretty worried about money after this 20 years. Then we've got scenario B. All I did in scenario B is I took the returns that we had over that 20-year period between 2000 and 2020, and I reversed them. So they were the exact same returns. They were just reversed. So the returns that we had in 2020 went back to 2000. 2000 went to 2020, et cetera. So I literally just reversed those returns. So as most people have probably figured out, mathematically, you have the same average returns, because they're all the same returns. They're just in a different order. So the average is the same. But in this case, you end up with $782,000. Even though you're taking the same amount, even though you have the same average return, why is that? Well, if we go back and we look at 2000 was a terrible, terrible year for the market. We had the dot-com crash in the US. huge fall in markets. So when you were initially starting to take money out of the market, you saw this huge drop, which of course is a problem because as you're pulling money out of the market, you have less money to actually then gain value as returns turn around. And that was actually a really bad decade. That decade from 2000 to 2010, in the US, the market actually had basically a flat return at the end of the day because we had that dot-com crash, then we had the GFC, not a great time to invest. In that second decade, things went a lot better. So if we put those second decade returns at the beginning of that period, you did a lot better. So this is sequencing risk. And so this is what we really worry about as investors. So yes, something to think about. Sequencing risk, longevity risk. At the end of the day, once again, as I've said, here's the problem. So the problem is, of course, that we have no idea how long we're going to live. And this is, I don't know if this is interesting, but this is a chart looking at the probability of dying at each age as a 65-year-old man. And what you can see is that if you even start retirement at 65, well, chances are you're going to spend a good amount of time in retirement because you can see the probability of dying at the early part of your retirement is pretty low if you actually make it there. So something really to consider. And longevity risk is, of course, why we don't want that withdrawal rate to be too high. So one important thing about the withdrawal rate, and I always get this question, so I'll just preempt it at this point, is the government also tells you what you need to take out of your super. You do not have to spend that. So when we're talking about withdrawal rates, whether you're removing money from super or not based on required withdrawals by the government, you don't have to spend the money. So really what we're thinking about the withdrawal rate is, okay, what can we safely spend? So just something to consider. So the problem that we run into, and the problem we run into with retirement is that the way to approach both of these twin risks that impact us are actually in conflict, right? So how do we address longevity risk or the risk that we run out of money? Well, the problem is that, or the way to do this is make sure our portfolio is not too conservative because we need returns ultimately. So over this long time horizon of retirement, we need to get returns. So we want to ensure that we don't get too conservative in our portfolio, don't invest in too many bonds and cash as a percentage of that overall portfolio. Problem is to deal with sequencing risk. The way to approach that is to minimize volatility. So minimize the amount that our portfolio bounces around. And the problem is the way we do that from an investing standpoint is we go to more lower volatility assets. So defensive assets like bonds and cash, just the thing that I told you not to buy to deal with longevity risks. So that's the challenge we have as retirement. And that's really why we need to focus on this withdrawal rate. So yes, remember that. All right. The 4% rule. One of those popular rules in personal finance. And I won't go spend too much time on this because I've done entire webinars on it. But yeah, this guy, Bill Bengen, a financial planner that lived in the US, came up with this 4% rule. So he looked at historic returns. He looked at a portfolio, 50% shares, 50% bonds. He did this in the early 90s because those are the returns he had because he came up with the 4% rule in the early 90s. So he looked at returns, as you can see, between 1926 and 1992. He used a real withdrawal rate. So basically what that means is you increase the amount that you take out by inflation every single year. And he defined retirement as 30 years. So if you retire for longer, 30 years, then the 4% rule doesn't necessarily work. So just remember, there's a lot of conditions and caveats in here. But that's the 4% rule. And the 4% rule was defined as this safe withdrawal rate. So the amount that you could actually take out of your portfolio and hopefully not run out of money for a 30-year retirement under historic market conditions. So under the conditions that he was able to observe. back then. So just remember, those are the things that go in there. So I'll also probably skip this slide because anyway, the two things that you need to think about are returns. If returns are lower, then of course that's a problem. We need to think about returns going forward, not those historic returns. We need to look at valuations, and we need to look at inflation, because inflation, of course, means that you're taking more out for retirement. All right, so how do we bring this whole thing together, or brining the whole thing together, as I wrote on the slide? So at the end of the day, if we figure out how much money we need and we divide it by a withdrawal rate, we know how much we need in our portfolio, and that can be the basis for setting a goal. So in this example, $40,000 a year divided by 4%. So 40,000 divided by 0.04 equals $1 million. We divide it by a lower withdrawal rate, 3.3%. We need more money, of course. So the lower your withdrawal rate is, the more money you need. But this is how you can come up with and estimate a goal for how much you need in super. So many times what we do is we just go and we look at estimates that or we see actual figures of what people at our age or around our age have saved in super and think, oh, that's good or bad. We hear these blanket estimates like you need $1 million in super to have a good retirement. Well, not necessarily. Maybe you need a lot less. Maybe you need a lot more. But we want to come up with our own rate, of course, to do that. So mathematically, that's how you do it. So you can spend a little bit of time setting that goal. And of course, as soon as we've set a goal, then it opens ourselves up to all sorts of good things, like figuring out how much we need to save for that goal. And the big thing about super is obviously there are different ways to get more money into super potentially. So whether those are concessional or non-concessional contributions that you make into super. And once we have a goal, we can start planning that out. We can start figuring out, okay, in order to get there, what is the rate of return I need, which will influence what we invest in? What is the amount that I'm contributing into super every year? So of course, that savings rate. So all sorts of good information that can go into figuring out a financial plan for yourself. All right. I don't seem to have many questions. I know it is fairly early. But I think that's everything I wanted to go through. So if anyone does have any questions, you, of course, can email me at mark.lamonica1@morningstar.com. But anyway, thank you guys for joining the late night edition of this from Nashville. So hope everyone is doing well, and send through an email if you guys have any questions.
This video has been prepared for clients of Morningstar Australasia Proprietary Limited and or New Zealand wholesale clients of Morningstar Research Limited. Any general advice has been provided without reference to your financial objectives, situation or needs. You should consider the advice in light of these matters and any relevant product disclosure statement before making any decision to invest. To obtain advice for your own situation, contact a financial advisor.